Welcome to the MHP Exchange podcast, where industry veterans Frank Rizzo and Eric Busadil generously share their wealth of knowledge in their new podcast dedicated to the manufactured housing space. They tackle tough questions to provide valuable insights for those considering investments in mobile home parks. If you're seeking answers in the manufactured housing space, this podcast is your go-to resource.
Welcome to another episode of the MHP Exchange podcast. Frank Rizzo here with you today. And joining us today on the program, we have a guest from the other side of the country, which is a rarity because a lot of times we speak to people on the East Coast or around, in and around areas where we operate on. But I'm very excited to hear the viewpoint from Washington on the West Coast. And joining us is Patrick McDonald. He's the co-founder of CMG Properties with CMG Communities. He's been in the space for a number of years, and he's built out a very expansive portfolio covering 6 states. Patrick, thank you for being on the program.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. And before we get started, why don't you give us a little background on yourself and how you found yourself owning and operating mobile home parks?
Yeah, no, it's kind of a random story, honestly. So my business partner, Nick, and I, we were corporate sales guys. And back in 2014, 2015, we wanted to start passively owning some real estate. And so we bought a couple of duplexes and triplexes. And in 2016, we kind of stumbled across a mobile home park that was local here in Seattle. It was probably about 10 minutes from my house, 10 minutes from his house. And we were excited because we could buy 15 units for $500,000 versus buying 2 units of a duplex for $500,000 here in Seattle. And so we purchased the park, and we kind of ran it day to day ourselves, right? We didn't have a property management team running it. We were there digging ditches, fixing the sewer, kind of turning the park around. But what we discovered during that whole process is that we really enjoyed the business model of parks. And so we decided, hey, let's go buy another one. And we bought another one out in Montana, and that was kind of our first dive into like managing remotely, right? Where we had an on-site manager and we're kind of doing all these things from Seattle. And about 6 months later, somebody came and offered us doubled what we paid for the park. And we're like, oh my God, we've hit the jackpot, right? We're geniuses. And so we took it and we rolled that into a couple other parks, and it just kind of snowballed. And, 4 years later in 2020, we had 7 parks, and COVID was just kind of starting. And so our corporate sales jobs, I was a physician recruiter, and Nick was a general manager for a dental supply company. And those kind of things stopped the beginning of COVID. And we said, hey, now's a good time to maybe do this full time. And so we decided to leave our corporate jobs and really focus on parks. And, fast forward to today, we have, just under 30 communities, about 2,200 lots. And, like you, Frank, we're vertically integrated and run our own team and do all the things like property management and our dealers and things like that. So this is kind of where we are today.
So in retrospect, like looking back, you could say, well, leaving the corporate world and becoming a park owner it made all the sense in the world. But at that time, like how did that feel at that time, leaving probably a career trajectory which would have put you in a very comfortable position, right? Like you could have probably continued on. Now you would have had some seniority, you would have had some benefits and that quote unquote guarantee that people look for. But you decided to pivot completely. So how did that feel at that moment? And what was that gut check that said, this is the right thing to do?
It felt like the divorce was imminent from my wife. Both Nick and I, we had a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old at that time. So obviously those are things that you're considering when you're leaving your job. I think both of our wives were like, what are you guys doing? Looking back now, Nick and I were fortunate that both of our wives did work and had income coming in. So it kind of allowed us to make that decision. But there's no doubt that it was definitely a scary cliff to jump off of and do. Um, I think Nick and I were both pretty successful professionals, and so we just kind of figured we'd make it work. But there was no doubt that it was definitely touch and go there for the first year or two.
So, but in some ways, that's the American dream. Like most people, they always dream of leaving their 9 to 5. You did it. Now, what's that? Was it all go? Let's go. Just start acquiring other communities. Or were you able to maintain that discipline? Like how was that? How did that trajectory for your business happen afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things holding us back when we were in the corporate world is that we didn't have enough time to go out and search for additional parks, right? One of the competitive advantages I think Nick and I have is that we're not afraid to get on the phone and call owners and find deals. And so by having time freed up on a day-to-day basis to go find parks, it really allowed us to accelerate kind of our growth. We in the beginning, we were kind of taking a shotgun approach, right? Like we didn't have necessarily hard parameters of what we wanted to buy. We just knew we wanted to buy more. And so that was a little bit of a learning curve, kind of understanding what we should buy and what we should avoid. But I do think having 40 hours plus a week to expand the business really allowed us to accelerate faster than we could if we would have kept our corporate jobs and tried to do it on the side.
And you and your partner, are really like value add investors. Like you will take on now infill projects, some things that most other operators probably shy away from. So what is your typical like buy box? What's your criteria? I mean, do you have a way that you filter out different opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed over the years, right? As we've kind of scaled. You're right. We've kind of done it all. We've done infill. We've done park-owned home conversions. We've done, utility infrastructure, total replacements, and things like that. I think today we're looking still at the value add parks, whether that's primarily through infill or park-owned home conversions. Our team is really good at converting park-owned home renters to owners, or bringing in new owners for those park-owned homes. And we're really good at infilling properties and selling homes. We have a great sales team. And so I think those are the kind of the two major things that we look for now when we're looking for parks.
And I always like having the sales question with other operators to see, how they look at that process, because I know how we look to do that. And I think that that's a big component to our value add, is how fast we can either sell homes to vacant homes to new people, bring in the infill. What is your sales process like? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? Like, how do you structure that to keep the velocity of new lease ups in your community?
Yeah, I mean, we're probably a little bit more centralized than I like. So our team here locally in Seattle does a lot of our sales with leveraging our on-site managers for things like tours. I'd like to be at a point where our on-site managers were doing, or even salespeople on-site, we're doing a little bit more in driving that sales process. But right now we're pretty centralized with our sales process, but it's, it's worked for us. I think, we sold maybe 65 homes last year in our communities, so like we're doing decent, having it centralized, but as we scale, we're probably going to need to be more local.
Yeah. I've found, and we keep it centralized as well, and that's why I like asking that question. We found that our managers, we want our managers to focus on 4 things, right? Number one, they're the brand ambassador. They've got to make sure culture and community standards are being held. They do collections. They've got sales, and obviously, if you're doing value add, there's some project management, at least oversight that's being done. But on this, most managers, and they've got a lot of work, and I have a lot of respect for the people we have on the ground. But the challenge we found is that because they're in the field so much, right? They're actually on the ground. It's not always great at getting the data, right? And so having that centralized keeps the flow of the sale process going, and we could kind of help direct them in certain ways, and the back office could assist. So I'm always interested to see how other operators are handling that, because that's a key component to the value add space. So I know you've just, you're based out of Washington, and that state, like New York, is highly regulated, and there's been a lot of talk of rent control initiatives happening there. I mean, are you experiencing that currently? Like, what's the state of that tenant advocacy in where you're operating?
Yeah, I mean, Washington historically has been a tough state to work in from a landlord tenant perspective for things like evictions, and there's a lot of resources for tenants out here. So evictions have always been difficult. Most recently, our world's been flipped upside down a little bit out here in Washington, and then back on May 7th, Governor Ferguson did sign a rent control bill here in Washington State. Unfortunately, there's no parity across the board. So traditional multifamily rentals have a 7% plus CPI cap on rent, but MH kind of got a raw deal, and we have a 5% cap on rents. And it's been, he signed it May 7th, which is the middle of the month. And so there's questions now, like what do we do June 1st, right? Do we honor the rent increases that we sent out? In Washington, it's 90 days notice for rent increases. So do we honor those June 1st, or do we have to take that down to 5%? And so there's a lot of questions swirling. How the law reads is it was not a great law on how it was written. So there's a lot of questions, and not a lot of people have answers. So it's been the last 30 days have been tough.
In what happens, did they specify if, like, there's a vacant lot? Let's say there was somebody in there, they moved their home, their rent was at X, and it's 50% below market. They leave. Can you move that to market, or do you have to go off the last registered rent for that rent price?
Luckily, we don't have vacancy control. So there was something in the bill initially that did say you can get a one-time increase of 10% if somebody moves out, but they've scrapped that. So you can go to market if somebody does move out, which is obviously helpful. But as you know, Frank, the average tenant in a manufactured housing community is there for 13 years. So when does that turn over, right? I don't know.
And the challenge, Patrick, and this part of the argument gets lost, right? Even though it's the one that makes the most sense, it's that when you have those controls in there, it disincentivizes operators from making future improvements that community needs.
Yep.
And one of the reasons why we pivoted out of New York City was, we saw back in 2016 the rules and the regulations for rent control and rent stabilization expanding, right? And now it's touching, if you own 10 or more units inside of New York State, you're under some sort of rent stabilization or rent control, and it becomes a challenging place to operate. Now in New York City, where they're talking about housing affordability issues, there's thousands of apartments that owners aren't making improvements to or bringing back on the market because it's too costly to put a tenant in. And it makes more sense to leave the unit vacant than to have it filled, because the cost it costs to run the property. And when that case is brought, sometimes they get, for whatever reason, and maybe it's because it's, the tenants, the tenant advocates are a large voting block, it gets lost in translation, and it really disincentivizes good operators like yourself from having to make that investment in the park to really raise the standards. No?
Yeah. I think it really long-term will impact the tenants of manufactured housing communities here in Washington. To your point, what's the incentivize to fix the roads or do anything to improve the park if you can't recapture that value? right? And so, especially for parks that are in maybe high desirable areas of, MSAs, it won't happen overnight, but 10 or 15 years down the road, they're going to look at those parks as better redevelopment plays versus maintaining them as manufactured housing communities, right? So, um, I think out here we're frustrated because the governor wants to prioritize affordable housing and creating more housing for people out here. And if anything, rent control does the opposite, right? And so it's just tough to kind of get through to folks, and it's frustrating.
I was talking with Jeff Cook, who's the largest MHP operator in New York State, and he did mention one, I guess, bright light, silver lining on all this. He goes, if you can master operating under the highly regulatory environment, you become more diligent everywhere else. So you just button up your processes, and when you enter into other markets, you just create a more efficient machine at some point, because you realize, like, okay, this is the process. There's added steps, and it helps your team kind of step up a little bit because they realize that they have to operate under that. And I'm sure that's something else that you'll see as this continues to go on.
Yeah, for sure. And I, with all that being said, we're not necessarily shying away from Washington State. We're just, you got to underwrite differently with the rules that are in place, right? And that's just kind of is what it is.
Probably will create opportunity for good operators and people who have, skill and ability in that market, and may keep other people out too, which could have a benefit. But you are in 6 states, so how do you how does your organization grow to that point? Because being in 6 states, that's pretty large scale business. Like, how are you structured and organized to handle that?
Yeah, in the beginning, we started in Washington. Then we kind of branched out to Montana, like I mentioned. We're still in Montana. Then we were in Idaho. Then we were in California. We had this thought process, like, if we can get there on a flight and be there within a couple hours, it's probably doable for us and the team. And we've always, if you remember, I said we bought our second park in Montana. We've kind of always had this manage from afar, leverage on-site people. And so that didn't scare us to kind of migrate outside just our local area. And so we've kind of always ran our business with that mindset. I think we've gone even further east. We're in North Dakota now, which is the furthest east we've gone. And that has a lot to do with just the size of the parks we want to chase. In Washington, it's not like the Southeast or the Midwest. There's not a ton of like 100+ pad parks here. And if they are, they're very expensive, very similar to like California. And so we've kind of migrated to look east a little bit to go find bigger opportunities, I guess, for lack of a better term.
So when you're looking at those opportunities, are you looking for a certain size park? Are you looking 100 lots or better? Is that one of your parameters?
Yeah, to give you an example, so we went to North Dakota last year. It was 480 spaces. And so we wanted to have scale in that market, right? We probably wouldn't go to, Cedar Rapids for a 50 pad park, but we might go there for a 200 pad park. I would say like 200 is probably our minimum to get into a new market, outside the West Coast.
Okay. But 480 pads, that puts you up there.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, was that you do an infill on that? Was it, physically stabilized in terms of the lot, or you're bringing in homes?
No, that was 70 vacant lots, 135 park-owned homes. Parks were in pretty good condition, so not a lot of like capital improvements that needed to happen at its core, but a lot of sales, a lot of infill. That's still going on. We bought that March of last year, so we're only just over a year into it.
So, and what a lot of, and I think it's lost because you speak to some operators, and when I first bought my first park or my second park, when we had the second park I bought, we had to bring in homes, and I didn't realize the value of having the dealer license to bring in homes at that point. Is that you mentioned that you're dealer in every state you operate in?
Yeah. So we're broker dealers and a mobile home dealer in every state, and broker dealer. So, we can post on the MLS and things like that.
Yeah. So, and for anybody listening, that's a huge value, because when you're a dealer, that means you can deal directly with the manufacturer, and you have different financing options available to you that as a customer you don't necessarily have. So that's the faster you could get that process started, especially if you're working on an infill project, the better value you can have, or actually monies that you could save over the long run. I mean, it's a huge difference in types of returns that you could be looking at.
Yeah, I would say out here in the Pacific Northwest, directly from the manufacturer, we're getting homes for 50 to 60,000 versus if you go down to the street dealer, you'd have to buy it for 100. So, you're saving 30 or 40 grand a pop by being a dealer.
And that savings, because I know you have, your mission has been affordable housing in terms of your operation.
Yep.
And we found that that's a savings that I could pass on to the consumer, who now could stay in our community. And quite frankly, we find that some people like living in a community, especially if there's some features and benefits, whether it's an amenity package or just being around other people, right?
Yeah.
They like that community engagement. And we could deliver that cost savings on the home to them by delivering the same home that you might be paying, $15,000 more if you bought it from a street dealer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think our goal is not to necessarily make money off our infill homes, right? It's just to break even. A lot of times we lose $5,000 or so, but it's just getting the home in there, getting a resident in there that appreciates the affordable piece of it, and obviously it creates value for our park, right? Every home we bring in is whatever, depending on your market, $50,000 to $100,000 in value to that community. So
sure. And that's so it almost becomes like a loss lead, and your community looks better, and quite frankly, it's you just end up with a better community there.
Yeah.
Now, and we didn't talk about this beforehand, but something that I find interesting, because similar to myself, I mean, you've been partners with Nick for over a decade now, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I've been my partner Eric, and he's not here today. But what's been the secret sauce to making that partnership work and work for the long term for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have kind of clearly defined roles in the business, right? It's not just two cooks in the kitchen having opinions on the same things. And so from the beginning, it was kind of natural. We just I did operations, he kind of did sales and acquisitions. And so to this day, that's kind of how it is. But I think more so than anything, we're best friends too, and our wives are best friends, and our kids are best friends. And so whether we wanted to break up or not, we probably couldn't. No, but I think just having that friendship before we were business partners has really allowed us to be good partners. And I think we're pretty honest with each other when things are coming up and something's not working right or we need to make adjustments. So
that's a huge point, because when you have a great partnership, you can have, and I'm sure this is probably true as you're building a business and you care about it, you're passionate about certain things that are happening one way or the other, right? And your partner there'll be plenty of times where your partner will be on the opposite side of that, right? And it's being able to have those honest and frank conversations where you could be passionate and heated, but it's fighting fair, if that makes sense, right? Like, all right, we're gonna make this conversation about this issue, And it's not of keeping score kind of thing of who, how many times was Patrick right? How many times was Nick right? Or how many times Frank was right? How many times was Eric right? It's about, hey, we want the same thing, and let's just figure out the best pathway there. And sometimes we might, fight like brothers, but we just want to make sure that we're putting out the best product possible.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we're both only children, so you can imagine those conversations.
So we did something one time. We we took a disc profile.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you. So we did it. We did the test. And so there's two things that you're typically high on, and two things you're typically low on. And it turned out I'm the high D and high I. He's the high S and high C. And I was like, no wonder why we get along. We never clash over the things that normally we clash at. When he's really serious about it, I'm like, all right, he probably knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think as you scale, it's so critical to have that accountability partner. Going forward, and even if you're by yourself, having somebody that you can go back and forth and with ideas, so this way you can fine tune your process along the way. So if you don't mind sharing a little bit about, your process now, like if you buy a park, Patrick, what's the things that you look for? And then what are your 90, 180 day action items that you want to take to turn that community around?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it really starts with, who our equity partner is, right? I think, Nick and I still buy our own parks, but we're not buying $20 million parks with our own cash. We just don't have that luxury. And so we have different equity partners, whether that's through syndications where we're crowdfunding for equity, or private equity. We do have a private equity partner. And then we kind of have some high net worth individual partners. And so each of those buckets have kind of a different return metric, right? So if we're talking private equity, they want to 2x their money in 5 years and get a mid-teen IRR return, versus our syndication where we're mostly long-term holders. Like, can we go create value and refinance this park in 3 to 5 years and hold it for forever, right? Same thing with our high net worth individuals, but a lot of times they want 6 or 7% yield. So every bucket kind of has their different return metric. And so the first question we always ask when we're looking at a park, if it meets our kind of initial criteria of scale and some value add component, whether that's infill or park owned home conversion, it's like, who is our equity partner for this, right? And if we think it's a good fit for X, can we go and fulfill that business model in their timeline? And so that's one of the first things that we do. Of course, once we decide who our equity partner is and we're going through the due diligence process, we have our whole process of underwriting, looking at performas, investigating the property, doing our DD, all that stuff. But after that, once we buy a park, we kind of come up with a 30, 60, 90. We're always doing 30, 60, 90. So when we buy a park, we're doing our 30, 60, 90. What are we going to try to do in those three metrics? Whether that's, we kind of call it our beautification process, right? When we go in and buy a park, where we're replacing signs, putting in new fencing, demoing out crappy old homes, doing junk days where people can throw away their stuff. So we're always kind of doing that in the beginning. And then once those 90 days are up, we're looking at the next 30, 60, 90 days, right? What are we going to try to do, whether that's rent increases or move homes in or start to sell homes off. And so it just kind of depends on the park, on how those first kind of 90 to 180 days look. But we break it down into 30-day increments so that we can manage it a little bit better.
Yeah. And then you could start counting the wins, right?
Right.
Because if you break it down and you start looking at these communities, I mean, my partner says it best. I mean, you're really developing a city, right?
Yeah.
You have 100 pad park. It's a mini city. And if you don't start counting that wins, you could be doing all this work and not realize the progress you're making.
Yeah.
And if you have that smaller, those smaller steps where you could celebrate, what's happened, it kind of propels you to move forward. So we try to make sure, especially our team, whether on the ground or off site, like you got to live in the gain and don't live in the gap where this didn't get done yet. I get it, but that's not a 30-day project. There might be a 180-day window for that. And what's the steps that we have to do to make that happen during that time? So I think that's a great process to do, just to keep everybody on track and keep the projects moving.
Yeah. Yeah. To your point, I mean, that park out in North Dakota, it's 100 acres. How do you manage that on a day-to-day basis without kind of like taking baby steps and looking back on your successes, for sure?
So what does your team look like now? Like, how, from the ground up, like how do you layer out that? Does every park you have an ideal of who's on site? Do you have are you assisting it with VAs offsite? Like, how is that set up?
Yeah, so our corporate structure is fairly small still. We have kind of a director of property management. We have a director of home sales. We have Nick and I. We have a transaction coordinator. We have kind of a title escrow person that assists with like transferring titles. And then we have kind of our head controller. And that's kind of our corporate level. Like that's who's here in Seattle. And then you mentioned VAs. We leverage virtual assistants and offshore employees a ton. So even in our property management, we have two virtual assistants that are regional property managers, right? Like they're managing 8 to 10 parks and are managing the on-site people there and are really great. We have a ton of Spanish-speaking tenants. And so those two VAs are actually from Colombia, which has been a huge benefit to not only speak to tenants, but like write notices in Spanish and things like that. And then on like on the bookkeeping side of things, we also have 3 VAs that are between Colombia and the Philippines that do a lot of our reconciling and kind of heavy lifting of the financials. And then our head controller then reviews those. So our corporate team is fairly small, but then you get to the on-site folks, and we probably have 30 to 40 people on site that are, to the smallest kind of least time person is like a park helper to like a general manager that's over, 1 or 2 parks. So it kind of varies in there. And of course, then we have maintenance guys or gals and landscapers and people like that.
Sure. It's funny because when you buy your first park or first 2 parks, you're probably doing everything yourself.
Yep.
Right. And then it's learning at certain growth points where you realize, all right, I need somebody to do this. Like, where am I best suited at, and what should I take off the plate next? And that's always the challenge, I think, for the entrepreneur to say, okay, well, somebody else is going to do this. They might not do it like me, but they're going to spend 100% of their time rather than me spending 15% of my time. And if they're 70 or 80% as good as I am at doing it, or I think I am, right? They're going to be better because they're going to spend more time in it. And that's a constant conversation that we have internally. Okay, how can we kind of how can we streamline this position, and who do we need next to make things more efficient? I mean, is that something that you're constantly reviewing inside your organization as well?
For sure. Selfishly, because I want to work less, right? But I think, we're to a point where we do mobile home parks, but we're running a business, right? And it becomes more about the business than the product a little bit. And so putting the right people in the right places and getting everybody on the bus, so to speak, is a lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis. Because you're right. Our director of home sales, when we were doing home sales, we sold 12 homes a year, right? Versus she just focuses on it. She sells 65. So it's like, there's always, if I could hire more people, I would, right? It's always that kind of balancing act of what can I afford and, where are we growing to?
But you hit the nail on the head, because I think where this differs from maybe other real estate asset classes, you really are buying a business. That mobile home park isn't just a piece of real estate. There's a business inside of that you're operating, and there's so many different verticals inside of it. So where you're talking about having a title and escrow department, because the moving of those home titles that's a full-time job.
Yeah.
You're buying a park that maybe you're getting a bill of sale in, maybe you're not, right? Or you're getting a bill of sale, but for you to sell it or to sell it to somebody with financing, you need a bonded title. There's so many different nuances in this space that doesn't exist in traditional real estate.
Yeah.
You really need to specialize in it.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we realized over the years is buying a bigger park is the same as buying a smaller park, but actually less work, right? Because you can hire better, more full-time people on site to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So if we buy a 400 pad park, we can have 4 full-time people there, versus if we buy a 40 pad park where we have to do all of the stuff here at the corporate level. And so we've kind of, part of the reason why we're going for bigger and better is or just bigger is because we can scale with on-site people and alleviate our corporate kind of need for the day-to-day.
Got it. And so that leads me to my next question. Like, where do you see yourself and your impact in this space over the next 10 years? Like, are you going to continue with a syndication model? Are you looking for other capital partners? Are you looking to bring this nationwide? Like, what's the plan for, CMG?
Yeah, I think, from a size perspective, I think over the next 10 years, we'd like to be, we're at 22 or 2,300 lots right now. I think if we were triple that in 10 years, I think that's a pretty good victory. I think we want to explore private equity more. It allows us, again, to buy bigger assets. Maybe the problem with private equity is that they're typically on a 5-year hold. And so I think we want to buy with private equity, but have another partner that wants long-term kind of cash flow and appreciation. And so that we can be a part of these parks, past 5 years. As outside Texas, they're not really building any new parks. And so every time we sell one, I cringe a little bit, because it's like, we're never going to get that back. Right. Probably not. So, we're in it for the long haul. We want to, I think it would be cool to pass the business on to the kids and let them run it. And so I think to the extent that we can scale, I think we want to keep growing.
Having that mindset just makes you better operators, because you're not looking at, hey, the short term, where can I take it next quarter? But how do I create long-term objectives for this community and really have the impact down on the ground? So that's powerful to hear. And Patrick, if people want to find out more about you, your platform, and what you're doing, how would they reach out to you? How would they contact you?
Yeah, so they can go to cmgparks.com, and then you can see all of our communities. You can sign up to be on our investor platform. So like I mentioned, we still do syndications with family, friends, friends of friends, friends of the pod, right? We still do those all the time. And so even if you just want to see what we have going on, cmgparks.com is a great place to start.
Well, that's great. And thanks for taking the time to be part of this program. And for those of you out there listening, if you found value in how Patrick is built his business or scaled his business, drop a line below share a review and a rating of this on whatever platform you're listening. That helps us get this message out to more people who are looking to find out about the MHP space. Thank you very much for being a part of this program today, Patrick. And until next time, everybody, happy investing.